When the Third Reich collapsed, so did the mythology around the man who built it. But while the world searched for answers in ruins, one group vanished into silence: Hitler's own relatives. The dictator who demanded absolute loyalty had left behind a family that wanted only to disappear. His name had become poison, and blood had become burden. Some burned letters, others changed surnames, a few fled across oceans. For 80 years, fragments of that hidden lineage have surfaced like bones in thawing ground, each one whispering about guilt, denial, and the unbearable inheritance of evil. The Allies interrogated some relatives briefly in 1945, but most were dismissed as irrelevant. Historians focused on generals and ministers, not on uncles and nephews. Yet in those quiet homes, from Lower Austria to Long Island, lay a parallel story of the 20th century. How an ordinary family negotiated extraordinary shame. The silence wasn't only fear of prosecution. It was fear of recognition. A surname could close doors, end jobs, attract hate. To survive, the Hitlers, Hiedlers, and Schmidts who shared that blood had to reinvent themselves. Decades later, journalists began to track them down. They found gardeners, mechanics, teachers, people who avoided cameras and refused interviews. Some destroyed photos before dying. Others swore never to have children, to make sure the bloodline ended with them. The family tree of Adolf Hitler became a map of erasures. But silence, too, is a kind of testimony. Behind it lives a question that haunts the descendants of tyrants. How do you live when history lives inside your name? Before he was a dictator, Adolf Hitler was a boy from a family already complicated by secrets. His father, Alois, was born illegitimate, taking the surname of his stepfather, Hiedler, or perhaps Heidler or even Hitler. Records blur. Alois's mother, Maria Schicklgruber, never publicly named the father of her child. Rumors later suggested Jewish ancestry, but historians found no proof, only gossip amplified by enemies and apologists alike. Still, the uncertainty became fertile soil for myth-making. Alois married 3 times. His second wife, Clara Polzel, was also his niece, a consanguineous bond that would later trouble biographers searching for psychological clues in the Führer's origins. Of their 6 children, only 2 survived infancy: Adolf and Paula. Clara adored her son. Alois ruled the home like a barracks. Violence and obedience were the family's grammar long before politics entered it. When Adolf rose to power, his surviving relatives became both assets and liabilities. The regime presented his lineage as pure, peasant, and Austrian German, carefully editing the record to remove scandals and inconsistencies. Files were sanitized, archives restricted, marriages arranged. The family's silence didn't start in 1945, it began the day the propaganda machine decided that even blood could be curated. If Adolf was the center of the storm, his half-brother Alois Jr. was its first fugitive. Restless and rebellious, he left Austria long before the world knew the name Hitler. In the early 1900s, he moved to Ireland, opened a modest restaurant in Dublin, and later drifted to London, where he married an Irish woman named Bridget Dowling. Together they had a son, William Patrick Hitler. William would become the family's paradox. He grew up in England, curious about his notorious uncle across the channel. In the 1930s, he traveled to Germany, seeking connection and opportunity. Hitler received him politely at first, even arranging small privileges, but William's ambition and arrogance irritated the regime. When he demanded a better job, threats followed. Realizing he was a pawn in propaganda, William escaped back to England, then to the United States, where he publicly denounced his uncle in interviews and lectures titled, "Why I Hate My Uncle." During World War II, William enlisted in the U.S. Navy, serving under a changed name. After the war, he disappeared from public life, settling on Long Island with his wife and children. He changed his surname again, to Stuart Houston, and lived quietly until 1987. His sons never married, keeping a private vow to end the family line. In American suburbia, the Hitler bloodline faded not with punishment, but with deliberate extinction. Silence became their monument. Adolf's younger sister, Paula Hitler, lived a life defined by loyalty and loneliness. She adored her brother, even as his world turned monstrous. During the regime, she worked under an alias in Vienna, avoiding publicity. When the war ended, she was arrested and interrogated by Allied intelligence. Her statement was chilling in its simplicity. "I cannot believe he did all those things." Whether denial or defense mechanism, it reflected the psychological shield common among relatives of perpetrators. After her release, Paula lived under the name Paula Wolf, borrowing her brother's pseudonym, as if clinging to the only identity she knew. She died in 1960, poor and alone, still speaking of her brother with sorrow rather than condemnation. Historians debate whether she ever grasped the scale of his crimes. What's certain is that she represents the emotional wreckage left behind: love that could not reconcile with truth, loyalty that became prison. Her life echoes a pattern seen in many families tied to dictators. They oscillate between guilt and nostalgia, silence and self-justification. To condemn a relative is to condemn part of oneself. To defend them is to betray humanity. Paula chose neither fully. She lived in the gray space where memory and denial overlap, a space her surname had made inescapable. After Paula's death, attention turned to the surviving branches of the family tree. Men who had lived entire lives hiding behind invented names. In Austria and Germany, distant cousins changed documents, moving from town to town. One relative joined the Wehrmacht and died on the Eastern Front. Another opened a small shop and refused to answer questions from journalists who discovered his identity in the 1960s. The most mysterious line belonged to the American branch, the sons of William Patrick Hitler, now Stuart Houston. They grew up on Long Island in a quiet, middle-class neighborhood. Neighbors knew them as polite, reclusive men who avoided any talk of ancestry. Over the years, reporters tried to find them. Most were turned away at the door. One journalist in 2002 recalled a curt response from the eldest brother: "We're not talking about that man. Ever." DNA rumors circulated, claiming that one or more descendants had secretly taken genetic tests. None were confirmed. The family maintained an unspoken pact of invisibility. They refused interviews, marriages, and children, as if to close the book their grandfather had opened. In the small cemetery where William is buried, his grave bears no mention of the name that shaped the 20th century. What makes their silence remarkable is not just what it hides, but what it confesses: that some legacies are too heavy to carry forward. In a world obsessed with ancestry and identity, the Hitler's surviving relatives chose anonymity over lineage. Their absence became the loudest statement imaginable. The world has always been fascinated by bloodlines, as if evil, genius, or destiny could be inherited like eye color. For decades, conspiracy theorists have hunted for proof that Hitler's relatives carried some genetic mark. Scientists, however, reject this idea completely. There is no gene for cruelty, no chromosome for ideology. Yet the myth persists, fed by cinema, novels, and online speculation. In 2010, a Belgian journalist claimed to have analyzed DNA from distant cousins in Austria and the United States, suggesting they shared a rare haplogroup possibly of Jewish origin. Headlines erupted, blogs twisted it into irony, and historians sighed. The truth: genetic ancestry is far too complex to confirm such claims. But the story reveals a deeper hunger, the need to reduce monstrous history to biology, as if that would make it safer to understand. The real inheritance isn't in blood, it's in memory. The descendants of perpetrators and victims alike inherit silence, shame, or vigilance. Every generation decides what to do with that burden. Some deny, some document, some disappear. The Hitlers, or Stuart Houstons, or whoever they chose to be, turned inheritance into disappearance. By choosing extinction, they transformed a cursed surname into a closed chapter. Still, society's obsession with their DNA says more about us than about them. We keep searching for genetic evil so we can stop looking for it in ourselves. Every few decades, the silence of the Hitler family draws a new wave of curiosity seekers, biographers, documentarians, and forensic historians chasing a headline: "The Last of the Hitlers." Some find fragments, a school report, a letter, a property record, and build entire documentaries from them. Others cross ethical lines, ambushing elderly relatives with cameras, demanding confession. In 1999, One reporter from the Telegraph tracked down one of William's sons in Patchogue, New York. The man, gray-haired and weary, said quietly, "You wouldn't understand. We live normal lives because we never talk about it." Then he closed the door. That phrase, "we live because we never talk about it," became the unofficial motto of the hidden family. Later, a German investigative team tried to contact extended relatives in Austria. Some refused, others admitted limited cooperation with historians under anonymity. Documents revealed secret pensions, post-war interrogations, and evidence that Allied intelligence monitored several family members until the early 1950s, fearing possible neo-Nazi exploitation. None were ever charged with crimes, but the stigma endured like an invisible tattoo. These investigations, while sometimes sensationalized, have an unintended value. They remind us that history doesn't end with surrender. It seeps into families, marriages, and the silence between generations. The relatives of dictators don't need to speak to tell a story. Their absence already speaks volumes. 80 years after the war, the name Hitler remains one of the most toxic in human language. It is a symbol, a warning, and a mirror. But for a handful of living people, it is also family. They did not choose their ancestry, yet they carry its shadow every time they fill out a form or sign a check. That's why many changed surnames, moved abroad, and built lives of anonymity. Their silence is not cowardice, it's survival. When historians look back, they see more than genealogy. They see a moral experiment that continues. Can a society separate identity from lineage, guilt from blood? The story of Hitler's relatives answers softly, yes, but not easily. Forgetting is impossible, redemption, uncertain. Yet by refusing to glorify or exploit their connection, the last of them may have done the only decent thing left, vanish. The irony is that their disappearance fulfills the dream of millions who wished that name would die out. And so it does, not through punishment but through choice, a quiet erasure that no regime could enforce, only conscience. As one historian put it, the story of Hitler's family is the final chapter of his downfall, the self-chosen extinction of his bloodline. The secret that the relatives kept for 80 years wasn't a hidden conspiracy or a buried crime. It was something simpler, sadder, and more human, the decision never to speak again. In post-war Europe, a surname could determine your fate. For anyone named Hitler, even distant cousins, survival meant disguise. In Austria, one nephew of Alois tried to resume his job as a postal worker but was dismissed after colleagues discovered his lineage. In Germany, landlords refused to rent to people with that name. One woman, a distant cousin in Linz, burned her birth certificate and re-registered as Huber. The stigma was absolute. The Allies did not persecute the family, they simply didn't have to. Society itself acted as the judge. The Nazi legacy became a contagion, and the name was the symptom. Teachers, employers, priests, all whispered the same warning: change your name if you want to live a normal life. Some resisted, insisting that a name was not a crime. They learned quickly that the world disagreed. Letters went unanswered, passports were delayed, jobs mysteriously vanished. For them, existence meant exile, sometimes inside their own country. Others fled entirely, to Canada, to Argentina, to Australia. They hoped that in the new world the name Hitler would mean nothing. But the echo followed them everywhere. Even in distant continents, the name was a wall. By the 1950s and 1960s, psychologists and sociologists began studying the children of war criminals. They wanted to understand guilt, denial, and inherited trauma. Hitler's relatives refused almost all contact. But other families, Goering, Himmler, Speer, participated. Their interviews offered insight into what the Hitlers might have felt but never said. Researchers discovered a pattern. Silence wasn't ignorance, it was protection. Many descendants grew up in households where the past was off limits, yet it haunted everything. In the tone of dinner conversations, in the reluctance to celebrate birthdays, in the absence of family photographs. Some carried psychosomatic illnesses, anxiety, or identity confusion. One psychiatrist described them as ghost children, raised by the shadows of people they never met. From these studies came a theory: Post-memory, the transmission of trauma across generations. It explained why even distant relatives could feel guilt for crimes they didn't commit. In the Hitler family, that guilt manifested as disappearance. The silence wasn't denial of facts but rejection of inheritance. The only therapy they found was anonymity. In 1989, an Austrian historian named Werner Maser discovered a set of letters believed to be written by Alois Jr. and Paula. They weren't politically important, no conspiracies, no secrets of the Reich, but emotionally revealing. They spoke about shame, loneliness, and family fractures. In one, Paula wrote, "The world will never forgive us, though we were guilty only of being born." Authenticity was debated, but the sentiment rang true. For the first time, readers could glimpse the psychological ruins left behind. Historians had long studied ideology. These letters showed the cost of intimacy with infamy. Even minor relatives, decades later, begged for invisibility. The letters also contradicted one myth, that the Hitler family was united. In reality, it was fragmented long before the war. Rivalries, jealousy, and resentment plagued them. Some despised Adolf even before he seized power. Others benefited quietly and then hid when the empire fell. The post-war years brought no reconciliation, only an unspoken verdict: they would never gather again. In the late 2000s, a rumor spread online that one of Hitler's great-nephews in the United States had agreed to an interview. A journalist from The Guardian traveled to Long Island to confirm. He met a man in his 50s, polite but nervous, who insisted the meeting stay off the record. The conversation lasted 10 minutes. When asked what he felt about the past, the man replied, "It's not our story to tell anymore. We're just the proof that it's over." He denied ever using the Hitler name, denied having children, and denied that his family carried any memorabilia. "We don't own a single photo," he said. "Not one." The journalist later wrote that the house felt like a museum of absence. Their decision to end the lineage wasn't bitterness, it was ethics. They didn't want a future where someone could use their DNA as a weapon or symbol. They saw themselves as guardians of closure. When the last brother dies, the name will die too. And maybe, for the first time, the world will witness a voluntary extinction made for peace, not for power. Historians face an uncomfortable question: how much privacy do the descendants of monsters deserve? On one hand, the public demands knowledge. On the other, the relatives have committed no crimes. The Hitler family stands at the intersection of these ethics. Each new documentary or book revives old pain for people who never asked to be remembered. Some scholars argue that transparency prevents myth. Others warn that endless exposure turns tragedy into spectacle. When one German network planned a series called The Hitlers Among Us, historians protested, saying it crossed the line from education into voyeurism. The project was cancelled. The dilemma reflects our cultural addiction to closure. We want the story to end neatly, with confession, justice, redemption. But history rarely gives us that. The family's silence, infuriating as it is to researchers, may be the only honest answer left. There is no tidy ending, no comfortable lesson, only endurance. In the age of online genealogy, no one truly disappears. Databases, DNA kits, and social media can resurrect identities people tried to bury. In 2018, anonymous users on ancestry platforms began speculating about potential relatives of Hitler, analyzing surnames and migration paths. Most were wrong, but the attempt showed a disturbing impulse: the need to turn even infamy into content. Digital immortality now threatens the very privacy the family guarded for generations. Old photos resurface, deepfake videos circulate, and algorithms recommend Hitler documentaries to millions daily. The descendants' silence now competes with the internet's endless noise. Ironically, the technology that promised to preserve truth often multiplies distortion. False genealogies spread faster than corrections. Every new revelation generates clicks, not clarity. If the living relatives still exist, their only refuge is offline, the one realm Hitler himself never knew. 80 years later, the family's story has become a meditation on responsibility. History books end with Hitler's death, but family history keeps breathing in secret rooms, unspoken fears, and unmarked graves. The relative silence is not just personal, it's philosophical. It asks whether some stories are too heavy to retell. Every dynasty leaves echoes. Kings leave heirs, artists leave schools, tyrants leave trauma. The Hitlers left silence. That silence, paradoxically, might be their redemption, the first moral act after generations of horror. Somewhere, perhaps today, a distant cousin signs a document under another name, pays taxes, raises no suspicion, and keeps the vow made decades ago, never to speak, never to reproduce, never to revive the name. History may never find them, and that's how they wanted it. The world once feared that Hitler's ideology would live forever. Instead, his family ensured that it wouldn't. The last secret they kept for 80 years was not scandal, it was mercy.